boys and girls. Today I have a classic story for you. It's called The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And you might have heard this story before. Maybe mom or dad or grandma has told it to you, and they might have heard it before from one of their moms or dads when they were a young boy or girl. So my story, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, is by the author Beatrix Potter. And I have many cherished stories by her, which means there's a lot of different stories about animals that she wrote. If you really like the story Peter Rabbit, I want you to go to the library and see if you can find another story by Beatrix Potter to read. So let's begin, and you can notice I've got Peter behind me and I've got a couple of rabbits next to me. Let's hear what kind of mischief Peter gets into. The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. And you can see all the girls have their nice pink jackets, while Peter gets a blue one. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there, and he was put into a pie by Mrs. McGregor." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But not Peter. He was very naughty, and he ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden. First, he squeezed under the gate, and then he proceeded to eat some lettuces, some French beans, and then some radish. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages. He jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes amongst the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on all 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have gotten away, although unfortunately he ran into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large blue buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons and quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop over the top of Peter, but Peter wiggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and he rushed into the tool shed. And he jumped into the watering can, which would have been such a beautiful thing to hide in, except it had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. "Kertsy-choo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was damp from sitting in that watering can. And after a time he began to wander about, going lippity, lippity, not very fast at all, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans back and forth to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him, and Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his watering cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She was very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail would twitch as if it were alive. Peter thought it was best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes. Presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions, his back turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the woods outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up that little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am so sorry to say that Peter was not very well during that evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea and gave him a dose of it. Now, 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime, and there's Mother giving him that tea. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, they had milk and blackberries for supper. So what do you think the lesson was from this story? Remember what his mom told Peter? Peter was told to go with his sisters to gather blackberries, but Peter decided to go on his own out to the garden. So I remember in the story he had that nice blue jacket on with his brass buttons. I have a little Peter stuffed animal here of my own that I like to keep at home when I read the story. So boys and girls, I hope you have a happy Easter and can enjoy some Easter stories and maybe some other rabbit stories with Mom and Dad or Grandma and Grandpa at home. Goodbye, friends.